So what's more likely? Thank you.
You're welcome.
An all-powerful, mysterious God created the universe and then decided not to give any proof of his existence. Or that he simply doesn't exist at all, and that we created him so we wouldn't have to feel so small and alone.
I think science, there's sometimes where it needs a bit of humility to look back at the historical context of what science believes and goes, man, 20 years ago we had different conclusions about this. Of course, science progresses and is able to answer things, and it's beautiful. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. Pastor Mark reacts. We're dealing with contact and the question of, can science actually disprove the existence of God? I'm gonna argue no, but why? Check it out.
I read your book.
Here we go.
Would you like me to quote you?
All right.
Ironically, the thing that people are the most hungry for, meaning, is the one thing that science hasn't been able to give them.
Yeah.
Come on, it's like you're saying that science killed God. What if science simply revealed that he never existed in the first place?
I think we're gonna need to get some air.
What?
And a few more of these.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Whew. A little chilly out here.
Yeah, this is nice.
I got one for you.
What do you got?
Occam's razor. You've ever heard of it?
Occam's razor. It sounds like some slasher movie.
No, Occam's razor. It's a basic scientific principle. And it says, all things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the right one.
Makes sense to me.
All right. So what's more likely? Thank you.
You're welcome.
An all-powerful, mysterious God created the universe and then decided not to give any proof of his existence. Or that he simply doesn't exist at all, and that we created him so we wouldn't have to feel so small and alone.
I don't know. I couldn't imagine living in a world where God didn't exist. I wouldn't want to.
How do you know you're not deluding yourself? I mean, for me, I need proof.
Proof. Did you love your father?
What?
Your dad, did you love him?
Yes, very much.
Prove it.
So I think one of the is Contact, obviously, and the Carl Sagan, based on the Carl Sagan story. And I think one of the things she's raising, of course, is the classic, there's not enough proofs in the world and science. We have science and we can kind of trust that. We know how that works and all of that. But I think, philosophers point out now that one of the critiques, if you can follow this argument, is one of the critiques of kind of the evolutionary story is that our minds and the way they interpret information, which is all we're doing. I mean, not to totally crack open the matrix here, but like everything we do is an interpretation of data streaming in. For instance, I was reading a book recently where they were talking about a guy who was deaf, and that sound itself, your brain trains itself to interpret sound. It's not just sound is sound. And so he was deaf his whole life, and then they gave him the surgery where he could hear, and he would hear things, but he didn't know what he was hearing because it was noise with no ability to interpret the noise. And after 5 years, he actually went back. He said, I want to go back to being deaf because I'm confused by the noise because my brain has never been trained to interpret the noise, which we do, of course, from the time we're small kids. Everything's interpretation. So one of the philosophical critiques is, if it's true that our brains and our minds have been simply constructed because of evolutionary development, then of course everything we believe is a result of that evolutionary development. Choices we've made, wiring that we've made over millions of years, over choices about survival and all of these kinds of things. Even our view, and if we can't really, if that is not necessarily hooking up with truth, but it's just hooking up with what was helpful in those moments to survive and be the fittest and whatever, then even evolution itself is a product of that very process in thinking. So if we can't trust our beliefs about God because they were just kind of built in our system and all of those things just to help us, then we actually can't trust our beliefs about evolution itself, because those conclusions are a product or a result of the very process. Our brains have been wired to interpret things in a particular way, not just based on objective data and the way the world works. And so we have to then, my point in saying that is be a little more humble in the way that we interpret the world. And I think science, there's sometimes where it needs a bit of humility to look back at the historical context of what science believes and goes, man, 20 years ago, we had different conclusions about this. 100 years ago, we believed different conclusions about this scientifically. And of course, science progresses and is able to answer things, and it's beautiful. And I think as, all right, Matthew McConaughey saying here, I agree that science actually points us toward the existence of God. It doesn't disprove God, because it's about physics, and the question of God is a question of metaphysics, which Jodie Foster's character talked about earlier. You say if you remove God, you remove meaning. And can't science kind of at some point give us even the answer to meaning? And to this point, of course, it can't. And it's an agnostic argument that even Richard Dawkins and other people make, where one day science and computers will even give us the answer to what is the meaning of our existence in the world. What is morality? What is beauty? What is consciousness? Where did it come from? We don't know it yet, but at some point in the future, some robot and computer system will actually be able to tell us that. Of course, that's an agnostic faith belief, a faith position about what the future is going to hold for us. And I think the reality is there are some things, science is dealing in the physical world of being able to take a scientific method, put something through it, hypothesis, verification, experiment, all of these things, and be able to say, okay, this is a conclusion about the physical universe. Great. Question of God is a metaphysical, it's an after the physical kind of question that science can point toward, but it can't disprove the existence of God because it's a category mistake. And so I think there's a humility that needs to be there. And of course, as McConaughey is saying, and just to kind of hit this final point, it's this question which I think is more and more interesting in the conversation today, because as many have pointed out, the debate between Christianity and science is kind of over to most scholars, most academics. They look at it and go, look, the debate between Christianity and science, there's no conflict here, right? Read Alvin Plantinga, read John Polkinghorne, Alistair McGrath, all these scholars who go, look, this isn't really a problem, and everyone kind of knows it. The question now is between, as John Gray points out in his book about 7 types of atheism, the problem now is between Christianity and his history. You got to prove Jesus was a historical figure. You got to prove the resurrection happened. You got to prove the New Testament or legitimate documents and history, and that becomes more of the discussion. And that's partly, and then there's another version that Matthew McConaughey's character raises, which I think is amazing and interesting in the present cultural context, which is more of the romantic question, the sage question, the what about beauty? Prove that you loved your father. Well, obviously you can't prove love. You can't put love through, and that's part of his point. Love is so real, and actually it's the same kind of, as cheesy as the speech that Anne Hathaway gives in Interstellar, it's the same spirit, same kind of question that Christopher Nolan writes in that movie, where it's which interestingly enough, Matthew McConaughey is in as well. There's this, you can't put love through the scientific method, and yet you believe in love. You can't put beauty, meaning through the scientific method, and yet you believe it exists. And so what he's trying to do is almost the second or third tier of conversation about existence and meaning. And it's kind of there's a book years ago written about C.S. Lewis calling him the romantic rationalist. And it's you've got to be able to fuse both those worlds together. Realize that one of the great arguments, as I mentioned earlier, about Christianity now is consciousness. Something we all know we're conscious, but there's no great scientific method producing why we as human beings are conscious versus the animals, and have one of the things that separates humans from animals is a self-awareness, a consciousness, a moral question, an existential question, and a transcendent question. And I think this is part of the great conversation that postmodernity has led us into in a good way. It's like you had the Enlightenment, and then if you look back historically over the last 300 or 400 years, and you had the Romantic period, and it's let's not just be about the science. There's all these other interesting exploratory questions about the romantic side of us. And I use that word romantic not in like a love you, but it's like the meaning, the artsy, what is beauty, what is love. And his point here is you're saying something is objectively true. I loved my father, loved him. And I don't just mean by action, like, well, I served him. Well, I made him coffee. That's not what she means. She means I loved him like in this way. And he's saying, prove it, because there's nothing you can put through the scientific method that proves love, and yet you believe it exists. And you're sitting here as a scientist saying it's objectively true. And so and of course, it's not some kind of proof that X doesn't exist or Y doesn't. It's just, let's make sure there's a humility in how we actually have these conversations and realize the limitations of science in regard to its critique of God, because as many have pointed out, it can't actually, as Stephen Jay Gould pointed out, adjudicate the question of the existence of God. That's not what physics is actually about. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. Make sure that you put in videos, put in questions that you want me to explore. Thanks for watching, especially if you're a skeptic and you're really legitimately exploring the question of God. So glad that you're watching these videos. Hopefully they're helpful to you.